How to interpret miracle stories in the Gospels. Let's begin with a little bit of review. As we saw in the previous lesson, the Gospels are a form of ancient biography, and ancient biographies differ somewhat from modern biographies. For example, ancient biographies are not strictly chronological in their sequence, and the individual stories, they tend to be arranged thematically instead. This is one of the reasons why the sequence of stories is not always the same in each gospel. But there's another important way that the Gospels differ from modern biographies. Unlike the consistent style of historical prose that shows up throughout modern biographies, the Gospels are made up of a wide variety of literary forms, or microgenres, from the ancient world. They incorporate genealogies, call narratives, miracle stories, symposiums, pronouncement stories, parables, beatitudes, proverbs, prayers, sermons, and various other forms. Because of this variety, the Gospels are a little bit like newspapers. When you read a newspaper, we realize that there are different types of articles, each have different formats and different purposes. We don't read a news report the same way we read a comic strip or an op-ed column, or a classified ad for that matter. Each has a different function. So also, the various forms in the Gospels should be read in light of their own conventions and intended functions. You shouldn't interpret a parable in the same way you interpret the crucifixion narrative, nor should you interpret a pronouncement story in the same way you interpret a beatitude. We will cover many of these forms in the course, but in this lesson we're going to focus on miracle stories. Miracle stories, like all other microgenres in the Gospels, are designed to contribute to the broader purpose of the macrogenre of the Gospels, ancient biography. They're to inform the reader about a person's life and character. In other words, the primary purpose of nearly all Gospel stories is to tell the reader something about Jesus. Readers rarely take this into account when they interpret the Gospels. Most treat the Gospels not as biographies, but as collections of fables. Fables designed to convey various moral or life lessons, or in this case, spiritual life lessons. Take, for example, the way children's Bibles and Sunday school classes treat the story of the feeding of the 5,000. A little boy, we are told, shared his lunch. Shared, of course, is a word that's not even found in the biblical text. The story becomes a morality tale for children about sharing with others, or a spiritual lesson for adults about how God will provide abundantly if we are generous with our scarce resources. These lessons warm the heart, but they miss the point of the story. Why? Because they involve a genre mistake. With fables, the moral of the story is the purpose of the story. But the primary purpose of gospel stories is to tell you something about Jesus, about his identity or his character. The feeding of the 5,000 is not designed to encourage generosity, but to help the reader to understand who Jesus is. Now, there's a special version of this fable fallacy that I like to call the "what would Jesus do" method, the WWJD method. This method assumes that the purpose of gospel stories is to portray Jesus as a role model. Now, there is, of course, biblical precedent for this. Peter and Paul do encourage us in their letters to imitate Jesus. But Peter and Paul were not instructing the readers to imitate everything Jesus does in the Gospels. The Gospels hadn't even been written yet. Rather, both of the apostles had a particular aspect of Jesus' life in mind, namely his willingness to sacrifice to serve others. The weakness of this WWJD method can be illustrated by the story of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. During the COVID pandemic, I was struck by the fact that Jesus responds to this woman's fever by doing everything that the medical professionals were at the time telling us not to do. Instead of social distancing, Jesus enters someone else's house and even brings along his disciples. He then touches the sick woman's hand. This prompts the crowd to bring all kinds of sick people to the house, and Luke's version tells us that Jesus laid his hands on each of them as well. Should Christians during a pandemic imitate these actions of Jesus as an act of faith? Or should they refrain from doing so as an act of neighborly love to prevent others from getting sick? Good exegesis requires that our answer to this question be governed not by the genre of the biblical be governed by the genre of the biblical text rather than by politics or sectarian theology. When reading the Gospels, the interpreter must distinguish carefully between descriptive and prescriptive content. Biographies, like other historical narratives, are primarily descriptive, telling you what happened in the past, rather than prescriptive, telling you what you ought to do. This means most gospel stories are not designed to answer the question, what would Jesus do, but what did Jesus do? One way to discern between descriptive and prescriptive is to use the criterion of variety. If Jesus does something in a variety of different ways, it is probably descriptive rather than prescriptive. Jesus' approach to healing exhibits an astonishing variety in the Gospels. Even with the same illness, his method varies. When Peter's mother-in-law has a fever, Jesus enters the house and touches her hand. But he takes the exact opposite of approach in John 4. When the Herodian official's son has a fever, he asks Jesus to travel to another town to heal him. But Jesus goes nowhere near the boy. Instead, he heals from a distance, saying, "Go, your son will live." Now, if we were to ask, what would Jesus do if someone has a fever? The Synoptics and John would give us conflicting answers. Now, the problem is not that what would Jesus do, it's not that that's a bad question. It's a good and valid question. The problem is that most gospel stories were not designed to answer it. That's just not how biographies work. Now, this is not to say that prescriptive content is entirely absent from the Gospels. They often include Jesus' teachings and exhortations about how to live, but for the most part, gospel stories are descriptive, and the prescriptive element is secondary. If the primary goal of the Gospels is biographical, and therefore the primary goal of the miracle stories is biographical, then our applications of the text should be based on what the story teaches about Jesus. In theological terms, application should flow out of the Christology of the passage. John's Gospel instructs us to think along these lines when it explains the purpose of miracle stories. He says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John here refers to Jesus' miracles as signs, and signs by definition point beyond themselves. According to John, miracles point to Jesus' identity as the Christ, the Son of God, and their prescriptive intent is that we should recognize him as such and trust him for eternal life. Application flows from Christology. Matthew offers a similar perspective. When John the Baptist sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another?" Jesus replies to him by pointing to his miracles. "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised, and the poor have good news preached to them." Again, miracles reveal Jesus' identity. Miracle stories in the Gospels frequently point the reader back to the Old Testament, but also forward to the ultimate saving work that Jesus accomplishes through his death on the cross. For example, immediately following the story of Peter's mother-in-law, Matthew explicitly tells the reader why it is significant. He says this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. The healing miracles thus point to Jesus' identity as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, who takes the sicknesses and diseases of the people on himself when he dies for them. Now, each miracle story makes its own contribution to the evangelist's portrait of Jesus. One helpful strategy for identifying this unique contribution is to examine the structure of the story. In the ancient world, miracle stories, both in the Bible and in pagan literature, typically followed a three-part structure. First, there's the introduction to the problem. Second, the miracle itself. And third, the confirmation and or reaction to the miracle. These are the core elements that constitute the miracle story form. Now, some miracle stories do have additional features. John's Gospel, for example, regularly includes a fourth element. He usually includes some extra dialogue, usually right after the introduction, that reveals the views of the characters in the story. In other words, you get to see what the characters think. Now, each part of the structure has significance for interpretation. First, there's the introduction of the miracle story. It typically gives some indication of how bad the problem or illness is, and by implication, why a miracle is needed. And because the gospel writers were concerned to show how Jesus aligned with or fulfilled the Old Testament, it's often useful when examining the introduction to the problem to explore possible Old Testament precedents for comparison. For example, the introduction to Matthew 8:23-27 describes Jesus asleep on a boat during a storm. And of course, this invites the readers to compare Jesus with Jonah. The rest of the story shows implicitly what Matthew will later state explicitly. Behold, something greater than Jonah is here. Second, the narration of the miracle itself is usually also revealing, especially the method that's employed. In miracle stories outside the Bible, magicians and miracle workers usually make use of some sort of formulaic and often, frankly, elaborate procedures. By contrast, Jesus uses no magical formulas and rarely employs the same technique twice. Instead, his method is often tailored to fit the situation, or it's designed to allude to an Old Testament parallel. Therefore, interpreters of miracle stories normally do well to ask the question, what does the unique technique reveal about Jesus? With the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus takes, for example, an unusual approach by having his disciples participate in the miracle. In the synoptic versions of the story, he instructs them, you give them something to eat. And the disciples object that 5 loaves and 2 fish are not enough. Now, this is probably a deliberate imitation of 2 Kings 4, where Elisha tells his servant, give to the people that they may eat. And the servant objects that 20 loaves are not enough to feed 100. In both stories, there's food left over. But the greater magnitude of Jesus' miracle, 5 loaves and 2 fish for 5,000 compared to 20 loaves for 100, that greater magnitude implies that Jesus is a prophet greater than Elisha. Finally, miracle stories typically conclude with a confirmation of the efficacy of the miracle. The 12 baskets of crumbs that are picked up after the feeding of the 5,000 not only echo the leftovers of Elisha's story, they also confirm the extent of the miracle. More significantly, the confirmation frequently includes a report of the reaction of the onlookers. These reactions are especially telling because they reveal how the miracle shapes people's views of Jesus. In John's version of the feeding of the 5,000, the reaction of the crowd suggests that they link Jesus not with Elisha, but with the predicted prophet like Moses. This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world, they say. The dialogue after the miracle reveals their reasoning. The feeding miracle reminded them of the manna in the Exodus. But Jesus' reaction to their reaction is even more telling. While not denying the comparison to Moses, Jesus surprisingly compares himself to the manna. The people are interested in the feeding miracle because they want to eat. But for Jesus, the purpose of the feeding miracle is to point to himself as the living bread that will be given for the life of the world. Just as healing miracles point to the ultimate healing that Jesus will accomplish on the cross, so also the feeding miracle points forward to the eternal life that Jesus provides when he gives his life for the world.